They all thought the danger lived inside that house. That was the first mistake. By the time anyone understood what was really happening behind the drawn curtains on Maple Hollow Lane, a frightened little girl had already spent days living inside a silence so heavy it seemed to swallow light, breath, and reason. The old man across the street had already been judged. The neighbor had already convinced herself she was watching the slow, private collapse of a child. And the truth, when it finally surfaced, would be far darker, far stranger, and far more painful than anything the neighborhood had whispered to itself in the safety of daylight. In a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio, where the lawns were trimmed, porch lights glowed warm at dusk, and people believed they knew enough about one another to recognize trouble when they saw it, Merrick Vale had become part of the background years ago. He was the kind of older man neighbors described in short, practical phrases. Reserved. Predictable. Polite, but distant. He kept his hedges neat, carried groceries in one trip no matter how heavy the bags were, and rarely stayed outside long enough for casual conversation. No one considered him charming. No one considered him dangerous either. He was simply there, like the old oak tree near the mailbox cluster, like the cracked sidewalk in front of the Wilson house, like the faint sound of a lawn mower every Saturday morning in spring. Then his granddaughter came to live with him. Bria Vale was 9 years old, small for her age, bright-eyed when people first met her, and known for the kind of shy sweetness adults liked immediately. After her parents' messy separation, she had been sent to stay with Merrick for stability, or at least that was how the story spread through the neighborhood. In small communities, facts arrived wrapped in interpretation. By the end of 1 week, everybody knew just enough to feel sympathetic and not enough to understand the shape of the family's pain. The child had been uprooted. The mother, Sailor, was dealing with too much. The grandfather had stepped in. That was the simple version, and for a while, it appeared to be true. At first Bria still moved through the street like a child who had not yet learned how quickly safety could vanish. She rode her bike in uneven circles on the sidewalk, drew chalk stars near the curb, and lingered near Lenora Pike's flower beds because Lenora always had time to ask about school, favorite snacks, and the names Bria gave to neighborhood squirrels. Lenora noticed children because she had built her life around noticing small things. A retired seamstress with careful hands and a habit of observing before speaking, she spent afternoons by her front window with mending in her lap and a clear view of the Vale house across the street. She had no intention of becoming part of anyone else's family drama. But sometimes trouble entered a person's life not because they invited it, but because they were the only one still looking when everyone else had turned away. The day everything changed began like any other autumn afternoon. The air was cool enough for sweaters but not yet bitter, the maples had started throwing copper and red across the sidewalks, and the neighborhood had settled into that familiar hour when children should have been coming home, garage doors should have been opening, and kitchens should have been filling with the harmless noise of evening routines. Lenora was in her living room near the slightly open window, threading a needle through pale blue fabric, when her eyes drifted toward the Vale house out of nothing more than habit. What she saw tightened something cold around her chest. Bria was sitting on the floor near the wall, perfectly still except for the violent way her small body trembled. Her knees were pulled up hard against her chest. Her arms were locked around them so tightly it looked painful. Even from across the street, Lenora could see tears on the girl's face. There was no childish sulking in that posture, no ordinary upset, no small family argument taken too hard. This was fear stripped bare. It was the kind of fear that erased expression and turned a child into pure instinct, as if every muscle in her body had reduced itself to one desperate command: make yourself smaller, quieter, less visible. In front of her stood Merrick Vale. His back was partly turned toward the window, but his posture was enough to freeze Lenora where she sat. He looked rigid, looming, severe. One arm was raised, and in his hand something caught the late afternoon sun with a sharp metallic flash. For one splintering second it looked unmistakable. A blade. A kitchen knife, maybe. Something narrow, bright, and dangerous. Lenora's breath caught so hard it hurt. The sewing needle slipped from her fingers and disappeared into the folds of fabric in her lap, but she did not even feel it. Her whole body had become an extension of her eyes. She stood too quickly, nearly knocking over the side table beside her chair, and stepped closer to the window. Merrick still hadn't moved much. Bria still hadn't moved at all. The girl's face was white with terror, her eyes lifted toward him in the helpless, trapped way of someone bracing for what comes next. Lenora had lived long enough to know the difference between discipline and dread. Whatever was happening in that room did not belong in the ordinary grammar of family life. It had the shape of a moment people regret forever. It had the stillness that often comes just before harm. A terrible rush of thoughts tore through her mind all at once. Had this been going on longer than anyone realized? Had Bria been hiding it? Had Merrick been different behind closed doors from the man the street thought it knew? Was Lenora misreading what she saw? Could she afford to assume she was wrong? She reached for the curtain with shaking fingers and lowered herself beneath the window line, her heart pounding so violently she could hear the pulse in her ears. She stayed there for several seconds, unable to move, staring at the floorboards of her own living room while the image burned behind her eyes. The child's face. The rigid stance. The flash of metal. It made no sense, and yet it felt more real than anything else she had seen all week. When she finally looked again, the angle had changed. The room across the street was harder to see. Merrick had stepped away from the window. The moment was gone, if it had ever existed exactly as she feared. But the fear did not leave with it. It settled deeper. It rooted. That night Lenora barely slept. Every creak in the house sharpened her nerves. Every passing set of headlights reflected across her bedroom ceiling like a warning. She replayed the scene again and again, trying to force uncertainty into it, trying to invent kinder explanations. Maybe he had been cutting fruit. Maybe he had been holding some household object at a terrible angle. Maybe Bria had been crying over something unrelated. But every attempt to soften the memory collapsed under the same stubborn truth. The fear on the girl's face had been real. Children can lie. Adults can misread. But terror that pure is hard to mistake. The next morning the curtains at Merrick's house stayed closed. By noon they were still closed. By evening the house looked sealed off from the world. Bria did not come outside. That was the second thing that began to press on Lenora's mind. In neighborhoods like theirs, absence became visible quickly. A missing newspaper might go unnoticed. A missing child did not. Bria had been a regular part of the street's rhythm. A bike left tipped near the grass. Sidewalk chalk near the curb. The rise and fall of a child's movement in the late afternoon. Suddenly there was nothing. No motion in the yard. No shadow passing the windows. No bursts of laughter from the porch steps. Just stillness behind curtains that no longer opened. Lenora tried at first to discipline her own worry. She was not a detective. She was not family. She knew enough to understand the danger of leaping from suspicion to accusation. So she chose something ordinary, almost embarrassingly simple, an excuse to knock on the door. 2 days after the window incident, she baked a small vanilla loaf cake because Bria liked sweet things, placed it in a tin box lined with wax paper, and crossed the street in the gentle fading light of early evening. The walk felt longer than usual. She could feel her pulse in her wrists by the time she reached the porch. When Merrick opened the door, he looked as he always did, composed, neat, unsurprised in a way that felt practiced. There was nothing wild or frantic about him. No visible stain of guilt. No visible crack in control. That made Lenora more uneasy, not less. Men doing terrible things did not always look terrible while doing them. From the doorway she caught only a thin slice of the house behind him, dim interior light, an unnaturally clean hallway, no sign of movement. The air carried a faint sterile smell she could not place at first, something like disinfectant layered over stale indoor heat. She handed him the cake and forced her voice into the shape of normal concern. Merrick accepted it with polite thanks and told her Bria was under the weather, resting, nothing serious. His tone was calm and almost gentle. That should have reassured her. Instead, it seemed too smooth, too ready, like an answer used more than once. Lenora let her gaze drift past him for any clue, any sign of the girl, but Merrick did not step aside. He remained planted in the doorway with the relaxed firmness of someone who intended to end the visit exactly when he chose. She made one more casual offer, the kind neighbors made all the time: soup, groceries, help if needed, but he refused with the same courteous finality. Then the door closed. Lenora stood there on the porch for a few seconds after it shut, staring at the chipped brass number beside the frame, the cake tin now gone from her hands, her unease no longer vague but sharpening into conviction. A child supposedly recovering from nothing serious should not vanish completely. Curtains should not stay sealed. A grandfather should not look so calm while keeping a house that felt like it was holding its breath. The following afternoon, she finally saw Bria again. It happened fast. Lenora was at her front window when the side door of the Vale house opened and the girl stepped out into the yard. For one hopeful second, relief flickered through Lenora so quickly it almost embarrassed her. Bria was upright. Bria was outside. Maybe this really had been illness and imagination, coincidence and poor angles. Then Bria turned her head. The child looked thinner already, or maybe it was only the way she carried herself. Her shoulders were curled inward. Her face seemed strangely empty, as if she had retreated somewhere far behind her own eyes. Lenora opened the window a little wider and called her over with forced cheer, the way any older neighbor might offer a treat or a small gift. Bria paused. She looked toward Lenora for less than a second. In that second, the relief died. The fear was still there. Not dramatic. Not loud. Not even fully formed into expression. Just a flash of recognition so raw and guarded it sent a chill through Lenora's body. Bria lowered her head immediately and walked faster, almost hurrying away, as if any attention from outside the house had become dangerous. She did not wave. She did not smile. She did not answer. She fled the moment without running, and somehow that was worse. A child who has learned not to run has already learned too much. That night Lenora took out an old notebook from the kitchen drawer and began writing down what she had seen. The gesture surprised even her. She was not the kind of person who dramatized events on paper. But instinct pushed her hand forward. She noted the dates. The closed curtains. The lack of outdoor activity. The expression on Bria's face. The strange visit at the door. The metallic object in Merrick's hand. Once the first few lines were written, the rest came more quickly. It felt less like composing thoughts and more like preserving them before the mind could soften them into doubt. She did not yet know what she would do with the record. She only knew she needed one. Fear, once challenged, often gets dismissed as imagination. Details disappear. Certainty erodes. She would not let that happen. The next morning she woke earlier than usual and took her tea onto the porch before sunrise. The Vale house sat across from her under a cold gray sky, still sealed, still mute. No kitchen light flicked on. No silhouette crossed the curtains. The place had the dead stillness of an abandoned home, except Lenora knew it was occupied. That knowledge made it worse. Silence from an empty place is one thing. Silence from a house holding a frightened child is another. As the hours passed, ordinary neighborhood life resumed around the strange still point of Merrick's home. Cars came and went. A delivery truck stopped 2 doors down. A golden retriever barked at leaves in a driveway. Yet the Vale house remained detached from all of it, as if whatever was happening inside followed rules separate from the world outside. Lenora found herself watching for movement with the strained concentration of someone tracking signs of life in a disaster zone. Then, just when she was about to go back inside, she caught a blur of motion near the narrow side passage by the house. A child's sweater. Pale violet. Hair loose and messy. A small figure moving unsteadily toward the back, too fast to call out to, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Lenora stood so abruptly her teacup nearly tipped over the porch rail. She recognized the sweater. She had complimented Bria on it only a week before. The glimpse lasted barely a heartbeat, but it carried the same dreadful impression as before. Not freedom, not play, not a child darting about in harmless secrecy. The movement looked unsteady, disoriented, like someone recovering from a shove or trying to stay upright after waking in confusion. By then Lenora's worry had passed the point where it could still be called nosiness. It had become responsibility. She walked later that day to the small corner store at the end of the block, partly because she needed milk, mostly because she needed another pair of eyes. There she found Della Hart, the store owner, a woman who had known neighborhood patterns almost as well as Lenora did. In cautious fragments, without yet making any direct accusation, Lenora asked if she had seen Bria recently. Della shook her head and admitted she had asked Merrick about the child days ago. He had brushed it off. Said Bria had changed. Said she was staying in more. Said sweets no longer interested her. That detail stuck in Lenora's mind because it felt absurdly wrong. Children did not lose interest in cake overnight for no reason. Small contradictions often revealed the biggest lies. By the time Lenora walked home with her grocery bag cutting into her fingers, the afternoon sky already dimming over the roofs, she was no longer debating whether something was wrong. She was only debating how wrong it was. She slowed near the Vale house as if merely adjusting the bag on her arm, and for one brief instant the downstairs curtain shifted. Behind the glass, a face appeared. Bria. Just for a moment. Pale, wide-eyed, watchful. The face of a child not simply unhappy, but contained. The look vanished almost at once. The curtain snapped shut again. But Lenora had seen enough. It was the look of someone trying to communicate without being caught doing it. Not a signal clear enough for evidence, but clear enough for dread. That night the notebook came back out. Lenora wrote longer this time. About the curtain. About the shrinking of the child's world. About the way the house itself seemed organized around concealment. And as she wrote, another thought began taking shape, one she resisted because it felt too severe and too frightening to name. What if the neighborhood had made Merrick into a harmless old man simply because he was old, quiet, and familiar? What if all the warning signs had been present in forms too subtle for people to register until the child was already trapped inside their blind spot? She put down her pen and stared into the dim kitchen for a long while. Across the street, the curtains remained closed. No one on Maple Hollow Lane knew it yet, but the story they were about to tell themselves was already wrong. The old man in that house was hiding something. The child was definitely afraid. The danger was real. But none of them, not Lenora, not the police who would later hesitate, not even Bria's own mother, understood where the true horror was standing. Not inside the room. Outside it. And before that truth came into focus, suspicion would harden, trust would break, and one little girl's terror would drag an entire neighborhood into a mystery none of them were prepared to face. By the time the unease settled into certainty, the house across the street had already turned into something else entirely. It no longer looked like a place where people lived. It looked like a place where something was being hidden. Each passing day tightened the pattern. Curtains stayed sealed from morning to night. No light leaked through in the evenings unless it was faint and quickly gone. No sounds escaped, not footsteps, not voices, not the ordinary noise of dishes or television that usually softened the edges of suburban life. Even the smallest signals of routine had disappeared. The Vale house had withdrawn from the world with a precision that felt deliberate. Lenora Pike noticed everything. She began structuring her days around the window without admitting it to herself. Morning tea lasted longer. Afternoon sewing slowed down. Even simple chores became excuses to pass through the living room where she could glance outside without appearing to watch. It was no longer curiosity guiding her attention. It was a growing sense that time mattered, that whatever was happening inside that house was not static but progressing toward something worse. Bria did not come out again. That absence became heavier than anything Lenora had actually seen. Children are movement. They are noise, interruption, unpredictability. When they vanish from a space they once filled, the silence they leave behind feels unnatural. Lenora tried to convince herself that illness could explain it, that rest required stillness, that perhaps she had overreacted. But every explanation felt thinner than the last. The memory of that first afternoon would not loosen its grip. The image of Bria trembling on the floor had sharpened in her mind instead of fading. The more Lenora replayed it, the more details seemed to surface. The tightness in the child's arms. The angle of her shoulders. The way her gaze had locked upward, not in confusion, but in anticipation. Fear that expected something to happen, not fear reacting to something already done. That distinction disturbed Lenora deeply. It suggested repetition. It suggested that moment was not an isolated incident. On the third day after her visit, Lenora saw movement again. Late in the afternoon, when the light had begun to dip into that golden, uncertain phase before evening, the front door of the Vale house opened just a few inches. Not wide enough for anyone to step through comfortably. Just enough to create a narrow gap between inside and outside. Lenora's attention snapped to it instantly. A figure stood behind the door. Not fully visible. Not clearly identifiable. But present. The gap remained open for only a few seconds. Then it closed again, slowly, carefully, as if whoever stood behind it was measuring the risk of being seen. No one stepped out. No one called for help. No voice followed. The door simply returned to its sealed position, leaving behind a stronger impression than if it had opened wide. Lenora's heartbeat quickened in a way she could not ignore anymore. That small movement changed something fundamental in her understanding. Whatever was happening inside that house, it was not passive. Someone was aware of the outside world. Someone was making choices about when to reveal even the smallest sign of life. That meant control. And control meant intention. That night, Lenora did something she had not done in years. She locked her own front door earlier than usual and checked the windows twice before going to bed. The fear she felt was no longer limited to concern for Bria. It had begun to spread outward quietly, into her own sense of safety. Not because she believed danger would cross the street, but because proximity to something hidden always creates its own kind of vulnerability. Sleep came in fragments. At some point past midnight, Lenora woke without knowing why. The house around her was silent, but her body was alert, as if responding to something beyond sound. She lay still for a moment, listening. Nothing. Then, faintly, something shifted in the distance. A soft scraping noise. Not inside her house. Outside. She sat up slowly, her breath shallow, and turned her head toward the window. The curtains were slightly parted, just enough to allow a narrow line of sight across the street. The Vale house stood in darkness, its shape barely outlined against the dim sky. Then something moved. A shadow crossed behind the lower window. Slow. Uneven. Not the steady movement of someone walking normally. More like a figure hesitating between steps, pausing, continuing, as if unsure of direction or strength. Lenora leaned forward slightly, her eyes straining to catch detail, but the darkness swallowed most of it. All she could make out was motion and the faint suggestion of a shape passing through a room that should have been asleep. The movement stopped. For several seconds, nothing followed. Then the light inside flickered once, dim, unstable, before cutting out completely. The house returned to total darkness. Lenora remained frozen in place, her pulse pounding in her throat. That single flicker felt like a signal she could not interpret, something incomplete but urgent. It did not match the explanation Merrick had given. A child resting from illness did not wander through dark rooms in the middle of the night. A house that had nothing to hide did not behave like that. By morning, her uncertainty had turned into resolve. She could no longer watch and do nothing. The first step she chose was careful, almost hesitant, but necessary. She reached out to Sailor Vale, Bria's mother. The number took some effort to find, pulled from an old contact passed between neighbors months ago when the family situation had first changed. Lenora hesitated before making the call, fully aware of the weight it carried. This was not a casual check-in. This was a decision that could fracture trust, escalate suspicion, and bring consequences she could not control. But doing nothing felt worse. When the call connected, Lenora kept her tone measured, her words structured around concern rather than accusation. She described the absence, the closed curtains, the changes in Bria's behavior. She avoided exaggeration, avoided conclusions, focused only on what she had observed. Even so, she could feel the tension on the other end of the line shift. Sailor had not been told any of this. From her perspective, everything had been stable. Merrick had reassured her repeatedly that Bria was adjusting, that she was safe, that she was simply spending more time indoors. Photos had been sent, dark, slightly unclear images taken inside a bedroom that revealed little but suggested normalcy. Lenora realized immediately how fragile those reassurances were. Distance made trust easy. Reality made it dangerous. By the time the call ended, Sailor had agreed to come. Not immediately, but soon enough. That decision gave Lenora a brief sense of relief, but it did not resolve the tension building around the situation. If anything, it intensified it. Waiting for someone else to arrive meant more time passing without answers. And time, in situations like this, rarely worked in favor of the vulnerable. Lenora began to notice more details she had previously overlooked. The trash bins outside the Vale house were lighter than expected. The usual rhythm of garbage collection suggested less activity inside than there should have been. Deliveries stopped appearing at the door. Even the mailbox remained untouched for longer stretches. Small inconsistencies began to form a pattern that pointed toward isolation. Not just social but functional. Then came the moment that pushed her further. Late in the afternoon, as she walked past the house under the pretense of heading to the corner store, Lenora heard something from inside. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough. A sound like a muffled cry, quickly suppressed. She stopped without meaning to, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. The sound did not repeat. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if something had been forced back down before it could fully emerge. Lenora stood there for several seconds, her grip tightening around her bag, her breath shallow. That was the moment doubt finally disappeared. What remained was urgency. That evening, she began writing again, but this time her notes were sharper, more deliberate. She recorded times, sounds, movements, inconsistencies. The notebook was no longer a place to process uncertainty. It had become a record of evidence, even if no one else had yet seen it that way. And as she sat there, pen moving across paper, one realization settled firmly into her mind. Whatever was happening inside that house was escalating. The fear she had seen in Bria was not fading. It was growing. And if no one acted soon, it might reach a point where no one could undo what had already been done. By the time help began to take shape, the situation had already slipped beyond simple suspicion and into something far more dangerous. Something that required proof, not instinct. Lenora understood that clearly. Concern alone would not move anyone. Not the police. Not even Bria's own mother. What she had seen, what she had felt, what she believed, all of it remained fragile without something tangible to anchor it. And so, for the first time in her life, Lenora stepped into a role she had never imagined for herself. Not a neighbor. Not a bystander. But someone actively trying to uncover the truth. She reached out to a young man on the street, a college student named Evan Rourke, known for fixing phones and setting up cameras for neighbors who didn't understand technology. He had helped Lenora before with small things. Updating her phone, installing apps, adjusting settings she never quite trusted herself to touch. This time, the request was different. She needed a way to see inside that house without being seen. Evan hesitated at first. Not because he didn't understand the request, but because he understood it too well. The line between curiosity and invasion was clear, and Lenora was asking him to step across it. But there was something in her urgency, something grounded and serious, that convinced him this was not about idle suspicion. This was about a child. That was enough. They worked quietly, carefully, choosing a position that would not draw attention. A phone was placed discreetly among the plants near Lenora's window, angled just right to capture the lower portion of the Vale house. It wasn't perfect. The curtains still blocked most of the view. But there were small gaps, moments when fabric shifted, edges that allowed glimpses inside. It was a narrow window into a hidden world. That night, Lenora sat alone in her bedroom, the phone screen glowing faintly in her hands. The live feed showed very little at first. Darkness. Stillness. The unmoving outline of curtains. Time passed slowly, stretching each minute into something heavy and uncertain. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen, refusing to blink for long, afraid of missing the moment everything changed. And then it did. Sometime deep into the night, the curtain moved. Not fully. Not dramatically. Just a slight shift, as if disturbed by something inside. A narrow opening formed, barely enough to reveal a slice of the room beyond. A dim light flickered on, weak and yellow, casting long, uneven shadows. And in that narrow space, Bria appeared. She was sitting on the floor again. The same posture. Knees pulled in. Arms wrapped tight. Her head slightly lowered, her body trembling in a way that could not be mistaken for anything else. Even through the grainy, distant view of a phone camera, the fear was unmistakable. It radiated through her stillness. There were no tears visible this time, but that made it worse. It meant the fear had gone deeper, past outward reaction, into something internal and sustained. Lenora's grip tightened around the phone. This was no longer a memory. No longer a question. This was happening again. And Merrick was nowhere in sight. That absence unsettled Lenora in a different way. Before, his presence had been the focus of her fear. Now, his absence created a new kind of tension. If Bria was alone, then what was she afraid of? Why did her body react as if something was approaching when nothing could be seen? The light flickered again. Bria's head moved slightly, not randomly, but with intent. She was watching something. Following something just outside the camera's frame. Her entire posture shifted, tightening further, as if bracing. Her shoulders rose. Her arms locked harder around her legs. Every signal her body gave pointed toward one conclusion. She was not imagining the threat. She was reacting to it. And yet, the camera showed nothing. After less than a minute, the light went out. The curtain fell back into place. The image returned to darkness. Lenora sat frozen, her breathing shallow, her mind racing faster than she could organize it. She replayed the recording immediately, watching every second again, searching for anything she might have missed. But the result was the same. Bria alone. Bria afraid. Bria reacting to something unseen. That was the moment doubt shifted direction. For the first time, Lenora's certainty about Merrick began to crack. Not disappear, but weaken. Because what she had just witnessed did not fully align with the version of events she had constructed in her mind. If Merrick was the source of fear, why was Bria reacting when he wasn't there? Why did her gaze track something beyond the frame, something that never appeared? The questions didn't clear him. But they complicated everything. The next morning, Lenora didn't wait. She contacted Sailor again, this time with urgency that could not be softened. She described what she had recorded, not as speculation, but as something witnessed in real time. The difference in her tone was enough. The hesitation that had existed before on the other end of the line was gone. Sailor agreed to come sooner. But still, it wasn't immediate. And Lenora knew that waiting even another day carried risk. So she made another decision. One that pushed things further than she had intended. She contacted the police. The report she gave was careful, structured, supported by what she had recorded. She avoided emotional language. Focused on observable facts. A child unseen 4 days. Behavioral changes. Recorded evidence of distress. Unusual patterns in the home. It was enough to prompt a visit, but not enough to trigger urgency. Later that afternoon, 2 officers arrived at the Vale house. Lenora watched from across the street, her heart pounding in a way that made standing still difficult. The moment felt like a turning point. Either her fears would be confirmed, or they would collapse under scrutiny. Either way, something would change. Merrick opened the door. From a distance, he appeared calm. Too calm. He spoke with the officers for several minutes before allowing them inside. The door closed behind them, cutting off any view of what was happening within. Time stretched again. Every second felt longer than the last. Lenora's eyes never left the house. When the officers finally came out, their expressions were neutral. That neutrality was devastating. They had seen nothing that justified further action. No visible harm. No immediate danger. The explanation given, illness, rest, precaution, had been accepted. Without stronger evidence, their ability to intervene was limited. Lenora felt something collapse inside her. Not her belief, but her expectation that others would act on it. The system required certainty. And certainty, it seemed, was still just out of reach. That night, she returned to the recordings. Watched them again. Slowed them down. Examined every frame. The image of Bria on the floor no longer felt like a single piece of evidence. It felt like a message that hadn't yet been fully understood. And slowly, a new possibility began to form. What if the danger wasn't where she thought it was? What if Merrick's behavior, the closed curtains, the isolation, the control, was not about hiding something from the outside world, but about keeping something out? The idea unsettled her more than the original suspicion. Because it meant she had been looking in the wrong direction. And if that was true, then whatever Bria was afraid of might still be out there. Watching. Waiting. Closer than anyone realized. Everything changed the moment the door was forced open, not by violence, but by a mother who had run out of patience, doubt, and time. Sailor Vale arrived earlier than expected, carrying with her not just concern, but a growing sense that something had already gone too far. The distance that once allowed her to trust Merrick's reassurances had collapsed under the weight of Lenora's persistence and the evidence she could no longer ignore. Whatever she had believed before no longer held. And when belief breaks, urgency takes its place. Lenora was waiting. There was no hesitation left between them. No polite uncertainty, no soft approach. The air between the two women carried a shared understanding that this was no longer a situation to observe, it was something to confront. Together, they crossed the street toward the Vale house, not as neighbors, not as visitors, but as people stepping directly into the center of something neither of them fully understood. Merrick opened the door. His expression had not changed. It was the same controlled calm Lenora had seen before, the same measured composure that made everything around him feel more unnatural. He did not appear surprised to see Sailor. He did not resist their presence. But there was something in the way he stood, something firm, something blocking, that immediately sharpened the tension. Sailor did not stop. She moved past him. Inside the house, the silence was heavier than anything Lenora had imagined. It wasn't the quiet of an empty home. It was the kind of silence that pressed inward, absorbing sound instead of carrying it. The air smelled faintly sterile, mixed with something stale and closed off. Curtains covered every window, sealed tightly, leaving the interior dim even in daylight. The hallway stretched ahead. No movement. No sound. Just stillness. Sailor moved quickly, her focus locked on one thing, the room where her daughter should have been. Lenora followed close behind, her chest tight, her mind bracing for something she could not yet define. They reached the door. It was locked. From the outside. That detail alone shifted everything. The moment Sailor realized it, something inside her hardened. There was no hesitation now, no room for explanation or delay. She moved with urgency, searching, finding the key, her hands shaking but determined. The metal clicked into place. The lock turned. The door opened. And the truth stepped into the light. The room was dark. Not naturally dim, but deliberately sealed. The windows were covered from the inside, layered in a way that blocked even the smallest trace of daylight. The air inside was thick, stale, almost suffocating. A single small lamp cast a weak, uneven glow across the space, barely enough to define shapes. And in the corner of the room, Bria Vale sat, curled in on herself. Smaller than she had ever seemed before. Her body was thin, too thin. Her face pale to the point of looking drained. Her hair unkempt, falling unevenly around her shoulders. She held a pillow tightly against her chest, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. There was no immediate reaction when the door opened. No sudden movement, no recognition. Just stillness. The kind that comes after too much fear. Sailor reached her first. Dropped to her knees beside her, hands trembling as she touched her daughter's shoulders, her face, searching for any sign of response. Bria's eyes were open, but distant. Unfocused. As if she were looking through everything instead of at it. Lenora stood just behind them, her breath caught somewhere between shock and something deeper. Something heavier. The image in front of her shattered any remaining uncertainty. Whatever had been happening in this house was not mild, not temporary, not misunderstood. This was damage. Real, visible, undeniable. There were marks on Bria's arms, faint but fresh. Scratches. Bruises in early stages of healing. Signs that her body had been under stress, whether from force, fear, or something else entirely. Her breathing was shallow. Her movements slow, delayed, as if her body had forgotten how to respond normally. Behind them, Merrick stepped into the doorway. Still calm. Still composed. That calmness now felt wrong in a way it hadn't before. Not because it proved guilt, but because it did not match the severity of what stood in front of him. A child in that condition demanded urgency, panic, explanation. Instead, there was control. Selah's decision was immediate. There was no more waiting. No more questioning. No more giving Merrick the benefit of anything. She lifted Bria carefully, the girl's body light in a way that should never be normal for a child her age, and moved toward the door. Lenora followed without thinking. Merrick did not stop them. That, too, was unsettling. He did not argue. Did not block the exit. Did not raise his voice. He simply watched as they left, his expression unchanged, as if whatever was happening had already passed beyond the point where intervention mattered. Outside, the air felt different. Sharper. Real. Bria was taken directly to the nearest hospital, the urgency now fully visible in every movement, every decision. The sterile calm of the house was replaced by the controlled chaos of medical response. Nurses moved quickly. Doctors assessed, observed, documented. The process began immediately. And slowly, piece by piece, the reality of Bria's condition emerged. She was severely undernourished. Exhausted beyond what could be explained by simple illness. Her body showed signs of prolonged stress, both physical and psychological. There were bruises that did not match normal childhood accidents. Marks that suggested repeated strain, repeated fear. Nothing overtly catastrophic, nothing that screamed immediate violence, but enough to confirm that something had been deeply wrong for a sustained period of time. Then came the detail that shifted everything again. Traces of sedatives were found in her system. Not enough to be lethal. Not enough to cause immediate harm. But enough to explain her slow responses, her detached state, her inability to fully react to the world around her. That discovery fractured the situation completely. Because now there were only two possibilities. Either Merrick had been deliberately harming her, or he had been trying to control something else. Lenora sat in the hospital waiting area, her hands clasped tightly, her thoughts racing in directions she could no longer organize cleanly. The image of the locked room remained fixed in her mind, but now it was layered with new information, conflicting, incomplete, unsettling. Nothing fit perfectly anymore. The narrative she had built, the one that pointed clearly at Merrick, no longer held without question. The evidence supported it, but not cleanly. Not completely. There were gaps. Inconsistencies. Pieces that suggested something more complicated, something not yet visible. Selah stayed with Bria. Refused to leave her side. The hours stretched, filled with tests, observations, quiet movements of medical staff. And as Bria slowly began to regain awareness, fragments of something deeper started to surface. Not clear explanations. Not full sentences. But reactions. Every time a male figure entered the room, her body tensed. Every time someone unfamiliar came close, she withdrew. Her fear was specific. Targeted. And that detail began to matter more than anything else. Lenora saw it. Selah saw it. And slowly, the question that had been forming in the background pushed itself forward with undeniable force. What if Merrick had not been the source of fear, but the barrier against it? That possibility did not erase what had been done. The locked room. The isolation. The sedatives. All of it still stood as undeniable facts. But now, for the first time, those actions began to look less like cruelty, and more like desperation. And if that was true, then the real danger had never been inside that house. It had been outside. Close enough to be seen. Close enough to be feared. Close enough that a child had learned to recognize it before any adult around her ever did. And somewhere, beyond the hospital walls, beyond the quiet street that still believed the worst was over, that danger was still there. Watching. Waiting. Unseen. The truth did not arrive all at once. It emerged in fragments, small, unsettling pieces that refused to fit together at first, each one shifting the direction of suspicion, each one forcing everyone involved to reconsider what they thought they understood. By the time those pieces finally aligned, the story had already changed completely. It began with the recordings. After Bria was taken to the hospital, Lenora handed everything over. The video footage, the notes, the timestamps, every detail she had documented with careful urgency. What once felt like fragile evidence suddenly became part of something larger, something official. The police reviewed it again, this time with more context, more pressure, and more reason to look deeper. At first, nothing new appeared. The same images. The same patterns. Bria alone in the room. Bria reacting to something unseen. No clear presence. No visible intruder. It still looked incomplete. Until someone decided to go back further. Not just to the moments Lenora had focused on, but to the edges of the recordings. The seconds before and after. The parts that had seemed irrelevant before now held a different kind of weight. And that was where the first real crack appeared. In one of the earlier clips, just outside the main frame, there was movement. Barely noticeable. A shadow crossing along the side of the property. It did not belong to Merrick. The timing didn't match. At that exact moment, Merrick had been visible inside the house, in a completely different location. The shadow outside moved independently, briefly touching the edge of the camera's range before disappearing again into darkness. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. Then it appeared again. Different night. Different angle. Same pattern. A tall figure. Thin. Moving carefully along the outer fence line, just beyond direct visibility. Not approaching the front door. Not making noise. Just watching. Waiting. Positioning itself close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid detection. Once that pattern was recognized, everything shifted. The police returned to the Vale house, this time not to question Merrick's behavior, but to examine the property itself. The backyard, the fence, the narrow spaces between neighboring houses. Every area that could have allowed someone to move unseen. And they found something. Not immediately obvious. Not dramatic. But undeniable. Near the edge of the yard, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes, there were marks on the fence. Subtle at first glance. But under closer inspection, they told a clear story. The metal had been cut. Not completely, but enough to allow it to be bent back and forth. Enough to create an entry point for someone who knew exactly how to use it. The cuts were recent. Clean. Deliberate. Someone had been coming in and out of that yard. Repeatedly. At that moment, Merrick's actions began to take on a different meaning. The cameras. The microphones. The sealed windows. The locked door. The constant surveillance. None of it looked like control anymore. It looked like defense. A perimeter. An attempt to monitor something that moved just beyond reach. When the officers confronted Merrick again, the tone of the situation had changed. The suspicion directed at him was no longer certain. It was complicated. And under that pressure, the truth he had been holding alone for weeks finally surfaced. He had seen the man. Not clearly at first. Just a presence. A figure near the back of the property late at night. Something that did not belong. Something that appeared, disappeared, returned. At first, he had doubted himself. Age brings that hesitation, the question of whether what is seen is real or imagined. But then Bria had seen him too. That was when everything changed. It had started weeks earlier, in the park near their home. Bria had been playing alone, just for a short time, within sight but not within reach. A man had approached her. Calm. Casual. Too close. Too interested. The kind of interaction that feels harmless to anyone watching from a distance, but not to the child experiencing it. Bria had run. That night, she had told Merrick. And Merrick had believed her. That belief became the dividing line between what everyone else saw and what he knew. He had reported it. Once. Twice. But without proof, without a clear identity, without something solid to act on, nothing had been done. The man was not caught. Not questioned. Not even confirmed. And so Merrick had made a decision. If no one else would act, he would. He began watching. Staying awake through the night. Tracking movement. Installing cameras where he could. Placing microphones near windows, doors, the edges of the yard. Every night became a vigil. Every sound mattered. Every shadow carried weight. And the man kept coming back. Not every night. Not predictably. But often enough to confirm the fear. Standing near the fence. Watching the house. Watching Bria's window. That was when Merrick locked her inside. Not to imprison her, but to keep her out of reach. He sealed the windows to prevent visibility. Kept the lights low to avoid drawing attention. Restricted her movement so she wouldn't wander into danger. And when the fear became too much for her to sleep, when she began waking in the middle of the night, crying, shaking, convinced the man was still outside, he made another decision. The sedatives. Not out of cruelty. Not out of control. But out of desperation. He wanted her to rest. To stop reliving the fear every night. To quiet the panic that no child should carry. It was a mistake. A serious one. But it was not the act of someone trying to harm her. It was the act of someone who felt alone in protecting her. As this truth came together, the investigation shifted direction completely. Attention moved away from Merrick, and toward the unknown figure. The shadow in the recordings. The cut fence. The repeated presence. The name surfaced through connection and memory. A man who had recently moved to the far end of the street. Darian Crow. Quiet. Unnoticed. With a history that had followed him quietly from another town. Rumors, complaints, suspicions that had never become charges. Until now. The police moved quickly. This time, there was enough. The surveillance footage was expanded, enhanced, analyzed further. Patterns emerged, entry points, timing, movement paths. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was forming into something concrete. And when they finally searched Darian's home, the truth that had been hiding outside the Vale house revealed itself in full. Inside, they found images. Dozens. Then hundreds. Photographs of children. Taken without consent. Taken from a distance. Taken from angles that suggested observation over time. Among them, Bria appeared again and again. In the yard. Near the street. At the park. Unaware. Watched. Followed. Documented. There were notes. Times. Patterns. Plans that had not yet been completed, but had been moving toward something inevitable. Something far worse than what anyone had imagined inside that locked room. By the time the police left that house, there was no longer any question about where the real danger had been. It had never lived inside Merrick Vale's home. It had been standing just beyond it. Night after night. Waiting. Watching. And getting closer. The realization hit Lenora harder than anything before. Every assumption she had made. Every conclusion she had drawn. All of it had been built on a partial truth. She had seen fear, but misread its source. She had seen control, but misunderstood its purpose. Merrick had not been hiding something from the world. He had been trying to shield it from something the world refused to see. And Bria had been the only one who understood that from the very beginning. Now, the truth was no longer hidden. But it had come at a cost. Because sometimes, by the time the danger is finally recognized, the damage has already begun. The moment the truth surfaced, everything that once felt certain collapsed under its weight. What had been seen as control became protection. What had been judged as cruelty revealed itself as desperation. And what had been dismissed as fear without reason turned out to be the most accurate warning anyone had received. But even when the truth is found, it does not erase what came before. It only forces everyone to face it. Darian Crowe was arrested before the neighborhood had time to fully process what had been uncovered. The search for him did not last long once his identity was confirmed and the evidence connected. Patrol units moved quickly, guided by patterns drawn from the surveillance data and the materials found inside his home. He had grown confident in his movements, comfortable in the belief that no one had truly noticed him. That confidence ended the moment the search began. He was caught not far from where everything had started. Near the same streets, the same quiet corners, the same shadows he had used for weeks. There was no dramatic chase, no final moment of escape. Just a man who had moved too long without consequence finally meeting the boundary he believed did not exist. When he was taken into custody, the relief that spread through the investigation team was immediate, but incomplete. Because the damage had already been done. Inside the hospital, Bria Vale remained fragile. Her body had begun to recover, slowly stabilizing under proper care, but her mind moved at a different pace. Trauma does not leave in the same way it arrives. It lingers, reshapes, hides itself in silence. Even after the source of danger is removed, the memory of it continues to exist, waiting beneath the surface. At first, she barely responded to anything. Her eyes remained distant, her movements careful and restrained, as if she were still measuring the safety of every action. The world outside her room did not feel real to her yet. It had become something uncertain, something that could change without warning. Sailor stayed beside her constantly. The distance that once existed between them had disappeared completely, replaced by a quiet, steady presence. She watched every small change, every shift in expression, every sign that Bria was beginning to return. Guilt settled heavily on her. Guilt for not seeing sooner, for trusting too easily, for allowing time to pass when something had already begun to break. But guilt did not help. Only presence did. And slowly, that presence began to matter. The first change was subtle. Bria started reacting again. Not fully. Not consistently. But enough to signal that she was still there, still reachable. Her gaze began to follow movement. Her body relaxed slightly in familiar company. The tension that once held her tightly began to loosen, even if only for brief moments. Then came the fear. Not the silent, internal kind that had defined her before, but something more visible, more direct. When unfamiliar figures entered the room, her reaction was immediate. Her body stiffened. Her breathing changed. Her eyes searched for something that was no longer there but still felt close. It was specific. And that specificity mattered. Because it confirmed what the investigation had already uncovered. Her fear had always been directed outward. Toward something she had seen, something she had experienced directly, something her body still recognized even when her mind struggled to process it. Merrick Vale remained under scrutiny during this time. Not as a suspect anymore, but as someone whose actions could not be ignored. The evidence had cleared him of intent to harm, but it did not erase the methods he had chosen. Locking a child in a room. Administering sedatives without medical supervision. Creating an environment that, from the outside, mirrored abuse. Those decisions carried weight. Legal consequences were considered, debated, examined carefully. But context changed everything. The recordings he had gathered, the devices he had installed, the patterns he had tracked, all of it painted a picture not of control, but of vigilance. Of someone who had stepped into a role no one else had taken seriously until it was too late. He had acted alone. Not because he wanted to, but because he believed he had no other choice. When he finally saw Bria again, it was not in the house that had become a place of fear, but in a hospital room filled with light, movement, and people who now understood what had been hidden before. The distance between them was heavy at first. Not physical, but emotional. Bria had been afraid. Not of him, but of the situation he had created around her. The locked doors. The darkness. The constant restriction. Even if it had been meant to protect her, it had still shaped her experience into something she could not fully understand. But fear, when given time and truth, can change. And in that room, with everything finally exposed, something began to rebuild. It did not happen quickly. It did not happen easily. But it happened. Bria began to respond to him again, not with the same fear that had defined her before, but with something uncertain, something in transition. Recognition. Memory. A slow return to trust that had never fully disappeared, only been buried under layers of confusion and fear. Sayla watched it all. And in those moments, she understood something she had not seen before. Merrick had never doubted Bria. Not once. When the first signs appeared. When the fear began. When the explanations did not make sense. He had chosen to believe her, even when that belief isolated him, even when it made him look unreasonable, even when it forced him into decisions no one else would have approved. He had acted on instinct. And that instinct had been right. Weeks passed. The case against Darian Crowe grew stronger with every piece of evidence analyzed. The materials found in his home revealed a pattern far beyond Bria alone. Other children had been observed, followed, documented. The threat had been larger than anyone realized. Bria had simply been the closest target. When the case finally reached court, the atmosphere carried a weight that extended beyond legal judgment. It was about recognition, acknowledgement, correction. The truth was presented clearly. Every image, every recording, every note recovered from Darian's possession. The pattern of behavior, the intent behind it, the steps he had taken to move closer without being seen. It was no longer speculation. It was undeniable. And within that truth, Merrick's role became clear as well. Not as a villain. Not even as someone careless. But as someone who had seen danger before anyone else believed it existed, and had acted, imperfectly, but with purpose. The judgment that followed brought closure to one part of the story. Darian was sentenced, removed from the world he had quietly infiltrated, stripped of the ability to continue what he had started. But closure in a courtroom does not end what happens inside people. It only marks the point where healing begins. Back on Maple Hollow Lane, the neighborhood slowly returned to its rhythm. But it was not the same. The house across the street no longer felt like a mystery. The curtains opened again. Light returned to the windows. Movement came back into the yard. Bria, still fragile but recovering, began stepping outside again. Carefully at first, always within sight, always aware. Lenora watched from her window. The same place where everything had started. But now, her understanding was different. She had seen fear, and misjudged it. She had seen control, and misunderstood it. She had acted, and in doing so, helped uncover something far worse than what she feared. That realization stayed with her. Because sometimes, the truth is not hidden in what is seen, but in what is assumed. And sometimes, the people who look the most suspicious are the ones standing between danger and those who cannot protect themselves. As the days passed, the street grew quieter again. But this time, The quiet did not feel empty. It felt earned. Because behind it, everyone now understood something they had not known before. Danger does not always announce itself. And protection does not always look kind. But when the truth finally comes into the light, it changes everything.